Okay, so yeah, hello, my name is Noel. And in case you haven't tried Solid or you don't know about any apps, I have made a few. Maybe you have already seen them and you can use them if you want to see how Solid works, if you have never used it. But actually, today I'm not going to talk about my apps. I'm going to talk about something called Interoperable Serendipity. Maybe for some of you, this is you don't know what this means or how this is related with Solid. But before we get into that, there is something else I wanted to ask. And it is when you look at this picture, what do you see? Maybe some of you are seeing a duck, or maybe some others you are seeing a rabbit. Well, the thing about this image is that there is no right answer. It's both a duck and a rabbit. And I see a similar thing happen when I ask people why they are using Solid, or they tell me why they are interested in Solid. For example, for some people, it's for privacy. They care about privacy and they see in Solid a solution to their problems. Also about owning their data, which is closely related with privacy. But maybe you are working on Solid or you want to learn more about it because you want to own your network. Like maybe for you, the problem when you have to switch applications is not losing your data or not having access to it, but you have to leave behind all your connections, right? This is also something that could be solved with Solid. But there is also something else I learned more recently that is called interoperability. And I'm sure there are many other reasons that I haven't mentioned of why people may be interested in Solid. But I want to make the case that for me, at least, interoperability is the most important property. At the beginning, I started learning about Solid and was interested because of the privacy angle, right? But later on, as I have been spending more time in the community and working with Solid itself, I have realized that actually, if we don't have interoperability, everything else is kind of pointless. And I want to share a quote from a presentation by Angelo Beltens, where he mentioned that there is actually no killer app with Solid. And actually, we don't want a killer app. What we want is an ecosystem of interoperable apps, applications that work together properly. And this is what actually can show what Solid is for and could fulfill the potential of Solid. In case you don't know what interoperability means, the basic definition is the characteristic of a product or system to work with other products of systems. This is a bit abstract, so I will share some specific examples. For example, if you think about email, it's a good example of interoperability because there are you can use different email providers and in different domains, and you can talk with anybody who is using the email protocol. So maybe you have a Gmail account, but you can talk with anyone that has an email, even if they are self-hosting it or whatever. So email is a good example of interoperability in practice. We also have RSS. For example, if you want to subscribe to a podcast, you can use many applications or you can even code your own. And it's an ecosystem where different applications work together and work properly. And maybe the best example of interoperability that we have is the web itself. Users expect that if they visit a website, it should work with any browser. And that's actually something important. For me, interoperability, it's not only saying that a product is implementing a protocol, it's also the expectation from the user. For example, for users, if you are using an email account and you see that you cannot communicate with other people, for you, this will not be interoperable. So it's also important to have into account the expectation of working together, right? And right now, I have put some examples of interoperability, but I think Solid is very interesting because if everything works properly and we start using Solid more and more, actually, we're going to have an ecosystem where everything is interoperable. No, we're not just going to have some verticals like email, RSS, or whatever. The point is that using Solid, you will just have apps and applications will use your data. And this can also create some situations where you combine data from different contexts. So this is why I think could be the answer for this could show the potential of Solid. But actually, when we think about interoperability, we think about it in black and white, like something is interoperable or it isn't. But the reality is that there is a gradient. Some things are more interoperable than others, right? And to see an example of this, we can look at a taxonomy that Cory Doctorow defined. For example, he said that the first level of interoperability is indifferent interoperability. This is what we find in the real world. For example, if you have a drum kit and you are going to buy some drumsticks, you don't have to think about what is the brand of your drum and your drumsticks so that they work together. You know that any of them is going to work. And beyond that, even things that are not engineered to work together, they can. For example, if you are playing a guitar and you don't have a guitar pick, you can use a coin as a pick and it's going to work. So this is the highest level of interoperability. But when we start looking at other examples, in particular in technology, for example, we see a lot of cooperative interoperability. This is what Solid is trying to achieve. And this means basically that things work together because they are designed to work together. But this is not as good as indifferent because, for example, if you are using the Solid protocol, but somebody else is using another protocol, even if it's cooperative and they are making it in a way that can be used together, it's not going to work with your thing without some effort. So that's why cooperative interoperability is not as good as indifferent, but it's also in the good direction. But finally, we have adversarial interoperability. This would be, for example, what Facebook or some big tech companies are doing, that they go out of their way to make things not interoperable. So even if you are using a website and it would be very easy for them to give you a way to export your data, they try to avoid it. So that is the worst type of interoperability we can have, which is almost none, right? But even at this level, we can still go deeper and see more examples. And everything is not black and white still. So for example, if we look between cooperative and adversarial, we have Facebook API. I just said that Facebook, they are using adversarial interoperability, but they have some features where they actually have cooperative interoperability. And that is what they expose through their API. And also inside of cooperative interoperability, even if you are using Solid, it could be within this range. It's not something black and white. And for me, I would argue that the best cooperative interoperability you can achieve is called interoperable serendipity. And if you get there, you are very close to indifferent interoperability. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at how we can get from the far edge of the cooperative interoperability to the interoperable serendipity. And for that, I have made 4 levels of interoperability. And the first one, I call it obfuscated interoperability. And we can look at that looking at an example. So this is a screenshot of my first Solid application, which is called Solid Focus. And it's a very simple task manager. And it has some things to it. So for example, it's using the Solid protocol. If you have a Solid pod, it could be self-hosted in your home, or it could be using from a provider like solidcommunity.net, and it should work. So in that sense, it's interoperable. However, there are some things that are not perfect. For example, it doesn't register the data location. So if you are using this application and then you use another task manager, it's very unlikely that you will see your data there, because since my application hasn't registered the location of the data, the other application will not be able to find where the data is. So this is something that could be improved. Also, it's using a very unconventional data schema. Since this was my first Solid application and I hadn't worked with the semantic web in the past, I didn't know a lot about how to model data, right? So I ended up using different vocabularies, and not everything is so intuitive as it should be. I don't think I am using the data properly. And even beyond that, this is not something I'm doing in my application, but there is nothing in Solid preventing you from doing this. You could be using a property that is supposed to be human readable, a string of text, but you can use that as a JSON encoded object, and you can drive your whole application like this. So even though it will work and people will be able to use Solid with your application, in my opinion, this will be the worst type of cooperative interoperability, right? So that's what I call obfuscated interoperability. And I call it obfuscated because even though it's using an open protocol, it's very difficult for someone to make an application that is interoperable with yours. And probably if someone wants to make an application today that interoperates with my Solid app, they would have to look in their source code. So that is not the best solution that we have. So that is for me the lowest level of cooperative interoperability. The next level, I call it intentional interoperability. For this case, we are going to look actually at the Focus version 2. So this is the same application I built some years ago that I started rebuilding it from scratch, now that I know more about Solid. So it still uses Solid to connect, so this is the same thing as before. But this time, I am using something called the type index to register the location of the data. So other applications should be able to find the data in the Solid pod. And also, I am using more conventional data schemas. I am putting conventional here in quotes because that's conventional from my point of view. But as you will find, if you start working with Solid and you dig more into this ecosystem, there is always something different with vocabularies. Like maybe for you, one data schema is very obvious, but then you find another application that is using another vocabulary because maybe they are not doing exactly the same thing that you do, etc. So I think at this point, it's on a best effort basis. If you use the vocabularies that you are using properly, you are doing it well, but there are still some limits there. So with all these checks, then I think we can have intentional interoperability. That means that two applications can be interoperable among them if you are intentional about it, but it doesn't go as low as obfuscated because I believe it would be possible for other applications to interoperate without looking at the source code, just looking at the data itself and which vocabularies it is using, and using best practices, it should be possible for other applications to interoperate. And at this point, since we have self-describing data, the data itself is pointing to the vocabularies, and we are using the Solid protocol, I think we have a very good case for interoperability. So in this case, it would be similar to the Facebook API, but the applications will have an API out of the box without the developers having to do anything specific for that. So I think this is something very powerful that we should take advantage of in the Solid ecosystem. And yeah, the next level then, I call it lens-based interoperability. And the thing here is that imagine we have two developers, Alice and Bob. And as we know, developers only know how to do task managers. So each of them makes a task manager, but they use different vocabularies. As I mentioned, it's not always super obvious which one to use. So they are using two vocabularies and they are using the vocabulary correctly. They are also using the type index, etc. But the applications are not going to be interoperable because they are different. However, we as humans or as developers who understand RDF, we can look at these files and we can see that they actually have the same structure. So it would be easy for us to make a mapping and say, okay, this field is this field, etc. Right? So this actually is something that can be programmed as well. There is this project called Project Cambria that talks about how you can do this kind of mappings between schemas and use them at runtime to translate the data itself. Cambria is not specific to RDF, but I think we can use these similar ideas to achieve the same results. And actually, in RDF in particular, we have this concept of shapes that is already well positioned to apply this idea of lenses as well. So I think if we combine shapes with lenses, we can achieve a much better compatibility. And that's what I call lens-based interoperability, because it's better than intentional, because you only have to define your lens. You don't have to refactor your whole application to work with the other one. So this is what I would call lens-based. However, we are still not, this is not the best possible scenario because you have to define the lens. There is still something you have to do. For me, the ideal situation would be what I call interoperable serendipity. And what do I mean with that? It has nothing to do with the movie, although that's what you may think about this word. At least that's what I did at the beginning. But for me, what I mean with that is that interoperable serendipity happens when apps built by different developers work together without explicit coordination. So this can seem a bit far-fetched, but it has already happened sometimes. For example, I made my application Media Kraken, and I presented it here some years ago as well. And sometime after, there was another application that also worked with movies called SolidFlix. And actually, I tested, and it seems like these applications are actually interoperable out of the box. And I know they were familiar with my application, but I doubt they looked at my source code because it's not 100% interoperable. But because they are using the same vocabulary, which is schema.org, the applications kind of work together out of the box. So this is for me a good example of interoperable serendipity, and this is what I would like to see more in the ecosystem, and what I think would show the true power of Solid. So the question still remains, how can we make that two developers who don't know about each other create applications that are interoperable? Okay, I have some ideas. For example, one of them would be to connect your application to a Lens repository. This means that even if a new application appears in the future, since you are connected to the repository, the application could download the lenses and interoperate with other applications without having to change any code. And this is not limited to only one repository. You could connect to multiple repositories or even allow users to configure their own repositories. So this kind of approach would be one step towards interoperable serendipity. There are actually some initiatives in going in this direction, even though they are not specific to lenses, but they are talking about shapes. So I think it would be feasible to create lenses from these shapes. And actually, if you are interested in this, you can join tomorrow's meeting, which Public already mentioned, where we are going to talk about shape repositories. So hopefully we can improve this kind of situation there. Also, there are other solutions that we can find. For example, we can use browser extensions. There are already some extensions that allow you defining some selectors to parse data from a website. So for example, here you can see how I can get all the tasks on a website. And then inside of each task, I can define each of the fields, like the name, the completion, etc. And once you have defined all these CSS selectors, you can extract the data. So doing this kind of thing, I think it would be possible to generate a lens as well, so that users that don't know how to write RDF for lenses, they could still use something to generate translations and make the applications compatible. You can try this website called webscrapper.io, which also does nothing specific to RDF, but you can see the type of UX you would have to create this thing, because it allows you to select parts of a website and extract some data. So I think the experience could be very similar. And also, obviously, we cannot have a presentation today without mentioning AI. So one solution to this problem could also be to use AI. So imagine that you use both applications, Alice and Bob's, and you create one task in each application. And if you had an AI installed in your pod that works for you, you could use this UI to generate a lens automatically. Since it has seen the example of the two applications, the two tasks, it could create the lens to translate among them. And in case you are not familiar with this concept of a personal AI, I suggest that you check out this writing by Tim Berners-Lee, and he also talked about it at the We Are Developers World Congress. So the idea here is that you would have an AI that is in your pod and it doesn't reach outside of your pod. So all the data is private and you can use it with sensitive data as well. So yeah, that's the basic idea. So I have given you some ideas of how we could reach interoperable serendipity, but I'm sure there are more I'm not thinking about. The point is that we have this in mind and we try to achieve it. So hopefully I have convinced you of how important this is for Solid and to achieve a better app ecosystem in general. And if you have any ideas or any comments about this, let me know. As for me, I am trying to work on this in my applications, and you are free to follow my work if you are interested. And here are some of links that I have already mentioned in the presentation. And if you want to look at my work, this is my website, and I'm also online in different social networks. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I'm now going to go over to Noel with a question about usability and accessibility. And the question was, are usability, accessibility, inclusivity, and universality a part of Solid? Are they an integral concept? And I'm going to add my own part to the question, which is, how does interoperability support accessibility and inclusivity?
Well, I guess this is like a can of worms. There are many things we could talk about it. But for example, one of the things I think this idea of interoperability is very useful for is for accessibility, because imagine that you are using an application and it covers most of your use cases, but for some reason it's lacking one feature that would make it more accessible for you, you know? The idea with Solid is that you can have another application that implements only this use case, and you can still use both applications. So you wouldn't have this scenario where you have to abandon something completely because it doesn't cover your whole ideas, right? But also something also to understand is that Solid is a protocol. And as I mentioned with the obfuscated interoperability, you can make something that is not accessible using Solid as well. Solid is just a tool, and it depends on how you use it. But yeah, that's my idea in general.
Awesome. And a follow-up question for you. We're hearing a lot about LLMs and language models at the moment. If these things can understand our data and I can just put all of my files into an LLM's chat history, do we even need this kind of data modeling and interoperability that you talked about?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think if anything, this idea of shaping data and vocabularies only helps the AI, because if you have everything defined in RDF, it's a lot easier for the LLM to understand it and generate for example, the lens in the example I was saying. But for me, when I say interoperable serendipity, it's not specific to Solid. The ideal scenario actually would be that two people make an application, one is using Solid, somebody else is not using Solid, and the applications work together. That would be the best use case, the best type of interoperable serendipity. So if AI or LLMs help us getting there, for me that's ideal. But I think we are still really far from that. So all the tools we do can only help us go further. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. We've got a question here from Ariba. This is also to Noel. Does it need to be RDF, or can an application define a spec using JSON and publicize documentations to humans for interoperability?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be RDF, but I actually have a blog post about this. So if you search why Solid and my name, Noel de Martin, you will come across this post. And in that post, I share why I think Solid is the best thing we have right now to make this a reality. So we are still far from this happening, but in my opinion, Solid is the closest thing we have. Because in the end, you could use whatever you want. You can use JSON, XML, you can make your own schema, but the point is that that other people can use it. And for me, Solid is one of the best things we have because, for example, we have different pod providers. So we have different implementations of servers that support the Solid protocol. And I am aware of many other projects, but most of them, they don't have a lot of implementations, or everything has been done by the same company or something. And I like the idea that RDF and Solid build on top of the web. And as I mentioned, for me, the web is one of the best examples of interoperability that we have working for real. So no, it doesn't have to be RDF, but I think it's one of the best things we have right now to make this a reality.